Ottawa History people, and welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. In our last episode, we learned about Étienne Brûlé and his travels along the Ottawa, and then across the Anishinaabe and Iroquois lands as a coureur de bois. One of the difficulties with a man like Brûlé is that he didn't leave a first-hand account of his life and his travels, so we need to rely on the words of others. A second issue is that while he had the charisma and social graces to make fast friends with Algonquin, Wendat, French traders, and English pirates, there were also many people who didn't like him on a personal level, and many of those wrote their opinions for posterity. A third issue is that because he was effectively a man alone in North America, his legacy goes a little unchampioned. The opposite is the case for his contemporary, and the topic of today's episode, Samuel de Champlain and his first trip up the Ottawa. Champlain wrote extensively about his travels and even published them, so we have a record. A great record if we assume honesty, but we don't 100% do that. He was generally well-liked and very much an establishment loyalist. He was steadfast to the Crown of France, the Church of Rome, and the merchants of Quebec and La Rochelle. His memory is much more celebrated than that of a mere fur trader. Champlain is generally assumed to have been born in 1567 in Brouage, south of France's premier Atlantic trading hub, La Rochelle. There is some dispute on this, because if he was born a year earlier or a year later, he would have been baptized a Protestant rather than a Catholic, which would have made his career significantly more difficult than it ought to have been. The French wars of religion were very complicated and outside of the scope of this podcast. Samuel was born into a maritime family, and in his youth sailed from France to Spain to the Caribbean and back several times. While not a nobleman himself, his wealthy merchant family allowed him networking possibilities, which would pay off when Henry IV appointed him as the Hydrographer Royal, the official mapmaker for the crown. One of Champlain's clients, the governor of Dieppe, Aymar de Chastes, was given a monopoly of the fur trade up the St. Lawrence, and he in turn commissioned Champlain to investigate the waterway and find a good site for a permanent trading post. De Chastes was given the monopoly after the previous holder's trading post at Tadoussac failed miserably when only 5 of the 16 settlers survived their first winter, which must have dampened the enthusiasm of Champlain and de Chastes, but not enough to deter them. In 1603, 68 years after Jacques Cartier's first exploration of the Gulf of the St. Lawrence, Champlain set out to follow his proverbial footsteps. On this trip, de Champlain had no official title other than cartographer, and he was subordinate to the ship's captain on the sea. Being born into the third estate, he could not aspire to an office of state, only a mapmaker, an advisor. Higher offices were reserved for the petty and the grand nobility of the first estate. Rejecting this comparative lowliness of his birth, Champlain published a memoir of his travels to the Americas in a book now called The Voyages of Samuel Champlain. At the time was called Des Sauvages, ou Voyage de Samuel de Champlain. Going forward, I'll note the original title, but I'll use the secondary one. In it, he described the land and inhabitants of the St. Lawrence as he'd seen them that summer. He also included his rescue of the ill-fated Tadoussac settlement. How well could he understand the land and the people of a continent that he only saw from the prow of a ship? Well enough to write a book, apparently. While I have to be careful about specifics of dates and numbers because I can be second-guessed and corrected by people on the internet, Champlain wrote in a time when anyone who could read and write was presumed to be correct. The lucky skunk. The book was successful, and he found backers to commission his explorations in the following summer of 1604, 05, and 1606. 1608 was the big year for his travels. Pierre de Gois de Mons, the governor of what was to become the Acadia colony, appointed him as his lieutenant on the St. Lawrence. Dugois was a successful governor despite his Protestantism. I'd mentioned that if Champlain had been baptized during the time when Protestants were in charge of his home church, his career would have suffered from this. But overt adult Protestantism didn't hurt Dugois, That's because rich nobility can get away with things that rich merchants cannot. Class was, and still is, a very important factor. This was Champlain's first official rank in the French state. Le Don de Dieu set sail on April 13th, found the St. Lawrence 51 days later on June 3rd, and spent a month sailing up and down the river from Tadoussac, where the Saguenay reaches the Sault of the St. Lawrence, to the abandoned site of Hochelaga on the island of Montreal, where the Lachine Rapids prevent further travel by heavy ocean-going vessels. On June 3rd, Champlain proclaimed that I could find none more convenient or better suited than the point of Quebec, so called by the savages, which was covered with nut trees. Quebec means the place where the river narrows in the Innu Montagnais dialect of Anishinaabemowin. Noting the nut trees, he then proceeded to cut them all down. Not out of spite, mind you, but because chestnut wood is excellent for building structures like the habitat that he and his men constructed. Of the 26 men that began constructing the new colony, one locksmith, Jean de Val, had an idea. His idea was killing Champlain and surrendering the colony to Basque whalers in the Gulf of the St. Lawrence as a gift for the Spanish crown, and retiring to the south of Spain as a rich man. 3 of his fellow colonists decided to conspire alongside him. Champlain learned of the plot, executed Duval, put his head on a newly hewn spike at the front of the colony, and sent the other 3 home to France. They were now down to 22 settlers, and the colony was less than a month old. When the snow receded and welcomed the spring in 1609, it was welcomed by Champlain and 9 survivors of that brutal winter, one of whom is presumed to have been a 17-year-old named Etienne Brulé, whom you may recall from our last episode. Relief in the form of foodstuffs for trade came from a mixed envoy of Ottawa, Algonquin, and Wendat traders from up the northerly river after the Lachine Falls. The Ottawa were from the Great Lakes region, but since they came down the northerly river, the river took the name of those travelers, La Rivière des Outaouais, and the source of the river was the Lac des Outaouais. The Ottawa were not, and I say this again, not from the Ottawa River basin. They just came down that river when traveling to Quebec. The Lachine Rapids at Montreal, despite the name, was not the gateway to China, unless you happen to be taking the very long route. Reinforcements from Europe arrived eventually, and Champlain continued to establish the French presence on the St. Lawrence. The following year, to solidify his alliance with the Wendat, Algonquin, and Innu, the French forces joined their indigenous allies in attacking the Mohawk at Sorel, just downriver from Hochelaga. The Mohawks were soundly defeated and would not be an issue on the St. Lawrence for decades to come. Sorel is at the mouth of the Richelieu River, at this point called the Rivière des Iroquois, for the same reason that the Rivière des Outaouais was named. The river would later be named after Cardinal Richelieu, the French Secretary of State, in 1642. The French and Allies outnumbered the Mohawks 300 to 100 and had the advantage of 5 arquebuses, a precursor to the musket. The Haudenosaunee fort was taken, and every single Mohawk was killed or captured by the victors. Champlain and his cohort continued up the river to its source at Lake Pitobagok and immediately named it after himself, Lake Champlain. Some of our American brothers and sisters like to name Lake Champlain amongst the Great Lakes. Ho, 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 they're adorable. But no. Consolidating this win, the Algonquin and French evoked the student exchange program to train future translators, including a young Etienne Brulé, who went off to winter with the Algonquins and the Wendat. Champlain took a young Algonquin named Sauvignon with him to France, but they failed to make a lasting friendship. While back in France, the 43-year-old Champlain became engaged to the 12-year-old Hélène Boulet, daughter of an important court official. They would be married 2 years later, and she would object to going to Quebec, but would reluctantly go, then go back to France and enter a convent. They had adopted 3 Innu girls while in Quebec, but had no biological children of their own. While wintering in France during the winter of 1611-1612, getting engaged and hosting Sauvignon, he was met by Nicolas de Vigneault, a veteran coureur de bois who had traveled up the Ottawa shortly after Brulé did. Samuel would later go on to describe him, the most impudent liar that has been seen in a long time, but at this point he held the benefit of the doubt. From Vigneault's time with the Kitchissipperini, he described his travels to the lands of the Nipissing, another Algonquin people, further upriver in modern-day North Bay and Lac des Outaouais. He learned that the Great North Sea was very close, and that Cree traders made regular runs there every year, and he joined them on a 3-week trek from Hochelaga to Hudson Bay, where he encountered Englishmen from a distance. At first, Champlain didn't believe these tales, instead trusting his abilities as a cartographer, understanding that James Bay was indeed very far away, and the likelihood of any European gallivanting around the frozen wastes was minor. Then came news from England that Henry Hudson and his son had been abandoned in Hudson Bay by their crews who wanted to come home rather than spend another winter trapped in the ice in the tundra of the far north. He forced Vigneault to swear an oath on his tales, and, with renewed trust in the adventurer, prepared a trip up the Ottawa River to its source at Hudson Bay. Those of you who passed a Canadian geography course as children may recall that the Ottawa River does not flow to James Bay. While Vigneault had certainly implied, if not outright stated, that he'd seen the Northern Sea, it would probably be more accurate to say that Vigneault said that the Algonquins said, that the Nipissing said, that the Cree said, that the sea was right close. In this game of whispers, the truth didn't filter all the way down to its final end at the ears of Samuel de Champlain. In 1613, the newly married Champlain returned to Quebec, dropped off his now 15-year-old bride in the growing trading post that was to become Quebec City, and began his trek up the Ottawa River to the Great Sea. One difficulty that Champlain had been encountering was that his Indigenous allies, for some unforeseen reason, did not want to surrender their positions to the French, giving the Europeans political, economic, and military dominion over them. The Innu at Tadoussac did not want to let the French explore up the Saguenay and have access to the furs there. Instead, the Innu wanted to protect their settlement as a trading post to their own benefit. The Anishinaabe and Wendat at Hochelaga felt the same way and did not want to be bypassed. The Odawa felt that Vigneault was telling stories, as the Hudson Bay run would take months, not weeks, as Vigneault claimed, and no sane person would start it this late in the year. While not the first European to cross the Ottawa, Champlain was the first to catalogue the experience. He noted that a waterfall fell like a curtain, naming it the Rideau Falls, and then, by extension, the Rideau River. He noted that the Algonquin called the area Astiku, meaning a boiling kettle because of the rapids that blocked further advancement. He used a French word to approximate Astiku when he labeled them as the Chaudière Falls. While portaging the rapids, Champlain, who like many great seamen was completely incapable of swimming, broke his hand and almost drowned. Just before the Astiku Falls is a small archipelago of 4 small islands, the largest of which is called Asin Abka and is now called Victoria Island. This island was not a permanent home to any village or community, but was a trading hub where local Algonquin met Odawa on their way to and from the St. Lawrence. When they reached the Île des Alimettes, they met with a one-eyed Kitchissipperini chief named Tessuat, who had met with Champlain at Hochelaga Island many times in the past. Tessuat claimed that Champlain was on a fool's errand, and that past the Nipissing allied lands of the north, the country was full of violent nations and sorcerers. Champlain suspected that this may have been Tessuat protecting his monopoly and ability to charge tolls, but he was also very suspicious of Vigneault's truthfulness at this point. Champlain personally reasoned to Tessuat that if the land was so dangerous, how could this one interpreter have traveled the country with only a handful of Algonquin fellows just a year and a half prior? This created an awkward silence for a moment, as Tessuat, who controlled all traffic past Alimette's Islands, replied that he had apparently never seen Nicolas de Vigneault before in his life. The awkward silence didn't last long. This is where Vigneault's tactic of fake it till you make it came to a disastrous end. He conceded that he hadn't personally gone, but had pieced together the data from other travelers. Tessuat, with much gusto, helpfully offered to rid Champlain of this meddlesome coureur de bois, but with sang-froid politeness, Champlain thanked him for the offer, but replied that his crimes were against the French, and the French justice in Quebec would be meted out. That night, Tessouat sent an envoy up the river in the direction of the Nipissing. This was noted by one of Champlain's team, and the decision was made to return downriver before the situation escalated more than it had already. It took 13 days to travel upriver to Allumette Island, and 10 days downriver to get back to the Lachine Portage at Hochelaga. No one spoke to Vigneault on that trip, at the end of which Vigneault confronted Champlain, saying that he could do it. He could find an overland route to Hudson Bay and be back before the snows. Champlain let him go, happy to be rid of the man. Vigneault did not return home before the snows. He did not return home at all. To this day, no one has found his remains. Champlain neglected to send out a search party. And that was the end of Samuel de Champlain's first trip up the Ottawa River, when many of the city's natural features were first named in a European language. His career would go on until his death by stroke on Christmas Day of 1635 at the approximate age of 64. He had spent the rest of his career fighting wars alongside the Wendat and the various Anishinaabe allies against the Haudenosaunee and their English and Dutch allies. He also developed the administration of New France from his seat in Quebec. He was eventually raised to the title of Lieutenant General of New France by Cardinal Richelieu himself, but never the title of governor due to his lack of noble blood. He was buried in the cathedral in Quebec City, though that cathedral burned to the ground just a few years later in 1640. His bones were not recovered, and there is no grave to house them. In his will, he left his considerable holdings in New France to his wife, Hélène, and to various Catholic institutions in the city. His cousin in France contested the will in Paris, and the records did not survive the tumult of history. Champlain's mark on Ottawa is very obvious to anyone visiting the city. There is a riverside neighborhood called Champlain Park, just upriver from the rapids where the explorer broke his hand in 1613. Close by is the Champlain Bridge that crosses the river into Quebec, where you can turn left and see the Champlain golf courses. One of the highest points overlooking the Ottawa River in the city is Kawiki Point, formerly Nepean Point. A large bronze statue of Champlain holding an upside-down astrolabe was placed there in 1915, and in 1918, an Anishinaabe scout, now called the Kitchizipi Omamiwinini, the Great River Algonquin, in bronze was added to the foot of Champlain's pedestal. As times changed, the optics of the kneeling Anishinaabe before the great statue of the heroic white explorer was less palatable. In 2013, the Kitchizibi Scout was moved to nearby Majors Hill Park and then moved back to Kawiki Point in 2019 for an official opening in 2025. City of Ottawa is neither decisive nor swift-moving. While both statues are again in the same park, they are no longer together. In a fitting metaphor of placement, Champlain is on the west side of the park, gazing westward at the new-to-him lands of the upper Ottawa River. This is just before Chaudière Falls, where he broke his hand. On the east side of the park is the Kitchizibi Scout, looking downriver in the direction of Hochelaga and the St. Lawrence, wondering how many more strangers might be coming. The fact that they look away from each other is a little sad, considering that Champlain did a really fantastic job of bridge building between the French and Indigenous communities of the Ottawa River Basin and the Great Lakes. He also developed strong relationships between churchmen, merchants, and government officials in his role as the Lieutenant General and the de facto head of New France. He had his enemies and his enmities, the early turncoats of the Quebec Post, Vigneault, Brûlé, the Haudenosaunee, and the English, to name a few, but that's to be expected from people in power. He cast a long shadow, and not everyone covered liked the shade. Thank you for listening. In our next episode, we'll be learning about the Recollect missionaries that accompanied the French colonial agents into the interior. As this is a new podcast, please take a moment to give us a 5-star review on whatever podcatcher you use, or preferably write a short review. This helps the algorithm promote the podcast, which is so essential as we start out. I really appreciate it. You can send me an email at ottawahistoryhub@gmail.com and follow me on Facebook at Ottawa History Hub, on X or Twitter at @OttHistoryHub. That's OTTHISTORYHUB. Please visit the website at Ottawa History Hub. Take care, everybody. Advance Ottawa, en avance!